Frank knew he was meant for something bigger than what his university life could offer. His days were consumed by lectures, reading heavy textbooks, and listening to professors drone on about the past, as though history were merely a collection of dates and events. He often felt disconnected, adrift in a sea of old pages, trying to find meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its pulse. Yet, it was this very pursuit of history that kept him grounded. Frank was a history major at the University of Pennsylvania, passionate about the intricacies of human civilization, its triumphs, its mistakes, and the little stories that defined its path. But deep down, he longed for something more personal, something beyond the dry pages of textbooks and impersonal facts. That's when he met her. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Frank first noticed her. He had been sitting at his usual spot in the university's coffee shop, bent over a stack of books, trying to make sense of ancient civilizations and their rise and fall. The coffee shop, with its low hum of chatter and the smell of espresso, had become his refuge from the academic grind. His eyes lifted for a moment, distracted by the sound of the doorbell chiming as someone entered. There she was, standing just inside the doorway, shaking raindrops from her dark, curly hair, wearing a vintage brown leather jacket and jeans that fit her frame perfectly. Despite the gloomy weather outside, there was something radiant about her, an almost ethereal presence. Frank's gaze lingered for a moment longer than he intended. He quickly looked away, embarrassed by his staring, but his thoughts seemed to chase her for reasons he couldn't quite place. She ordered her coffee in a soft, almost melodic voice. Her mannerisms were precise, thoughtful, nothing too forced, nothing too casual. Frank found it odd, but there was something undeniably magnetic about her, something that seemed to pull him in without him even realizing it. He couldn't help but glance back at her as she found a seat near the window, her back straight, her posture unshakably poised. Curiosity gnawed at him, and after a few minutes of internally debating with himself, he stood up, grabbing his coffee and making his way to her table. "Mind if I join you?" Frank asked, his voice carrying a mix of hesitation and hope. He was usually reserved, a bit shy, but something about her made him feel like taking the chance. She looked up, her eyes bright and intelligent, with a hint of something unreadable beneath them. "Not at all," she replied, a slight smile curling the corners of her lips. "I could use the company." Her eyes lingered on his face for a fraction longer than necessary, as if she were trying to place him. Frank sat down, his heart beating a little faster than usual. This was different. This was new. The first few moments were filled with small talk, college life, the rain outside, mundane things. But then, the conversation shifted. It was subtle at first, but Frank could feel it. She was knowledgeable, remarkably so, about topics he never would have expected. They talked about history, of course, given Frank's major, but she didn't just know facts. She spoke with a depth of understanding that bordered on uncanny. For instance, when they were discussing the fall of the Roman Empire, Michelle casually referenced obscure theories by scholars Frank hadn't even heard of. "You know, the economic collapse in the late Roman Empire wasn't just a matter of poor leadership," Michelle said, swirling her coffee. "It was a culmination of external pressures, trade disruptions, cultural change, and internal fragmentation. Most historians focus too much on the military defeats, but they miss how intertwined the collapse was with the empire's ecological struggles." Frank blinked, taken aback. I didn't know about that," he said, slightly flustered. "I mean, I've studied the military aspects, but I never really thought about how culture could have played a role." Michelle shrugged, a faint smile on her lips. "It's easy to forget that history doesn't happen in a vacuum. Everything affects everything else." Her response was so casual, but her insight was anything but ordinary. Frank tried to brush it off as a fluke, as if maybe she had read an obscure article or happened upon a random historical theory. But as the conversation progressed, it became clearer to him that Michelle wasn't just well-read, she knew things in perfect detail. When they discussed the French Revolution, she mentioned an obscure letter written by Marie Antoinette in 1792, a letter that historians had only recently rediscovered, and whose contents were still being debated. The letter details Marie's desperation in the face of the growing insurrection. She wasn't as cold and disconnected as people think. It's a shame how her legacy has been shaped by misconceptions, Michelle remarked, almost wistfully. Frank's eyebrows shot up. How do you know that? It was only recently uncovered by historians. I've never even read the full letter. Michelle's lips twitched into a small, knowing smile. I suppose I have my sources, she replied cryptically, but the look in her eyes made it feel like she was holding something back. It was strange. Frank couldn't put his finger on it, but he had the distinct feeling that Michelle was speaking not just from knowledge, but from experience, like she had been there in those moments, watching history unfold firsthand. He tried to shake off the thought. It was ridiculous, of course. She was just well-read, a unique and quiet soul with a love for history. There was nothing unnatural about her. And yet, Frank couldn't deny the growing sense of intrigue. There was something about her presence that felt out of place in a good way. It was as if she had a depth that was beyond her years, a maturity that went beyond just academic knowledge. Over the next few weeks, their meetings continued. Frank and Michelle would meet at the coffee shop between his classes. He looked forward to their conversations, finding himself captivated by her perspective on everything, from history to philosophy to the arts. But there were even more moments when Michelle's odd behavior unsettled him. For example, one afternoon as they were discussing the Civil War, Michelle seemed unusually anxious when they touched on the Battle of Gettysburg. She fidgeted, her gaze darting toward the window, as if she were lost in thought. The Union victory at Gettysburg really shifted the momentum of the war, didn't it? Frank remarked. Yes, it did, Michelle answered, but there was a strange tension in her voice. She didn't meet his eyes. After a long pause, Frank tried to steer the conversation back to more familiar ground. But it wasn't just the battle itself. It was also the larger political and social implications. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the push for the Emancipation Proclamation. Michelle nodded slowly, but Frank noticed her eyes seemed distant. She looked out the window, lost in her own thoughts. I think there's more to that speech than we realize, she muttered under her breath, almost as if she were speaking to herself. It's not just about equality. It's a message about survival. Frank didn't understand what she meant by that, but the moment lingered in his mind. It wasn't the first time she had offered cryptic comments, and though he was fascinated, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something much deeper than her unique insights into history. But for now, he chose to ignore it. Maybe Michelle was just a quiet, quirky woman with a deep love for history. The more time he spent with her, the more he was enchanted by her mystery. She was like a riddle, compelling, intriguing, and a little bit unsettling. And for the first time in a long time, Frank found himself eager to keep uncovering the puzzle she presented. What he didn't know yet, however, was that Michelle was more than just a brilliant woman. She was about to turn his understanding of history and reality upside down. Frank woke up early the next day, his mind still buzzing with the conversation he had with Michelle. It wasn't just the allure of her presence that had captured him, but the oddities of her knowledge, things she seemed to know with such certainty, things that made no sense in the context of what he was studying. He couldn't stop thinking about it. For the first time in his life, he felt like the world of history he had spent so many years immersed in, his carefully constructed understanding of the past, wasn't as solid as he had believed. The ground beneath him seemed to be shifting, and all because of a woman who knew more about history than anyone he had ever met. Over the next few weeks, he found himself meeting Michelle more often. They'd sit at the same corner table in the coffee shop, and Frank would bring his textbooks, working on assignments while they talked. At first, he treated their conversations as casual exchanges. He enjoyed the intellectual stimulation, and her perspective was always refreshing. But soon things started to get weird. One afternoon, Frank was discussing the American Revolution, laying out the standard narrative: colonial dissatisfaction, taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, and the inevitable conflict that led to independence. So, it's clear that the revolution was sparked by economic tension and philosophical ideals, Frank explained, leaning forward on his elbows. It's a classic story of people rising up against tyranny. Michelle took a slow sip of her coffee, her gaze never leaving his face. "I wouldn't say classic," she replied, her voice calm but with a subtle edge of something he couldn't quite place. The revolution was about more than economic dissatisfaction. It was about survival. Frank frowned, puzzled. Survival? What do you mean? She placed her cup down and folded her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly. You see, it wasn't just about the taxes. It wasn't even really about the rights of the colonists. It was about the growing fear of what was coming in Europe. The revolution was their way of preparing for something much bigger. Frank blinked, trying to process her words. Bigger? Like what? What are you talking about? Michelle's gaze shifted, distant for a moment, as though she were staring through him and into another time altogether. There were whispers, Frank. Whispers about war in Europe, the spread of revolutionary ideas, and something even more dangerous coming from the East. They had to fight to preserve the little they had, and it wasn't just about independence from Britain, it was about their place in the world. Frank shook his head, confused. But the revolution was about freedom, about liberty, and breaking free from British imperial rule. That's what all the historians say. Yes, she agreed, her eyes returning to his, but it was also about preserving the land, the food, and the social order. The colonists weren't just worried about Britain. They were worried about what the revolution in France would mean for them. The French Revolution had been in the works for years, and the American revolutionaries were scared that the same forces of unrest could take root here. You just don't know about the things that were happening in the background. Frank's brain whirled, trying to make sense of her words. He had never read anything that mentioned such a connection between the American Revolution and the French Revolution at this level. Sure, there were vague mentions of the influence of European thought, but this was different. Michelle wasn't just providing an opinion, she was suggesting a completely alternate view of events. She spoke as though she were there, like she knew things that even the most meticulous historians had missed. He grabbed his phone and quickly pulled up some notes from his last lecture. But according to Professor Morgan's lecture on the causes of the American Revolution, there's no evidence to support any such link. The French Revolution doesn't even start until more than a decade later. Michelle smiled slightly, leaning back in her chair. It's true, you won't find it in the textbooks. But you have to look at the context, Frank. Think beyond the written word. History isn't just about facts, it's about understanding the currents beneath the surface. She paused and gave him a pointed look. And sometimes you have to listen to the people who lived it. Her words lingered in the air, unsettling him. Frank opened his mouth to respond, but the thought of arguing felt futile. How could he argue with someone who spoke with such conviction, who seemed to know things no one else did? A week later, they sat at the same table again. Frank had been reading a chapter on the rise of the Roman Empire, diving deep into the political and military events that shaped its foundation. He couldn't help but mention it to Michelle, eager to share his excitement over a subject he loved. The Roman Republic was essentially a response to internal instability, Frank explained, trying to stay focused. The system of checks and balances in the Senate was designed to prevent any one person from seizing power, but of course, it failed. Michelle listened intently, but this time her reaction was different. She furrowed her brow. That's one way of looking at it, but it's not entirely accurate. Frank looked up, raising an eyebrow. What he means? The problem with the Roman Republic wasn't just political instability, Michelle continued, her tone calm but insistent. The Republic's collapse was rooted in something deeper, something most historians overlook. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing in thought. It wasn't just the Senate's failure. It was the economic system that collapsed first. Frank blinked. Economic system? Yes, she said firmly. The Romans built their empire on the backs of slaves, and over time, it created an unsustainable system. When the population of slaves grew too large, the economy began to crumble. The wealth gap grew so vast that the people who actually fought the wars for the empire, those who were out there on the front lines, couldn't even afford to support themselves or their families back home. Frank opened his textbook, flipping through pages. But that's not what I learned. The standard explanation says it was about the rise of military leaders like Caesar, who used their personal armies to undermine the Republic's democratic structure. That's part of it, but only the surface, Michelle said, her voice steady. What no one talks about is how the empire's economic collapse was the true beginning of the end. The social upheaval caused by economic disparities was just as important as the military conflict. The Republic couldn't sustain its wealth through war anymore, and that broke the system. Frank was stunned. He had spent years studying the fall of the Roman Republic, and never once had he considered the economic structure as the driving force. The books he read, the lectures he attended, all of it had painted a far more traditional narrative. How could Michelle know all these details, all these facts that seemed to contradict everything he had learned? The questions gnawed at him. Was she just a prodigy with an unusual way of interpreting historical events? Or was there something more to it? In the following days, Frank began to feel a creeping unease. He went back to his textbooks, cross-referencing everything Michelle had said. The more he dug, the more discrepancies he found. Dates and events matched, but there were subtle differences, details that didn't align with what he had been taught. One afternoon, after another of Michelle's odd, contradictory comments about the medieval period, Frank decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. Something wasn't right. "Michelle," he said, his voice low, "how do you know all of this?" She paused, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't interpret. It wasn't fear, but something close. "Why do you ask?" "Because," Frank said, swallowing hard, "it's not just your knowledge. It's the way you speak. You know things that aren't in any of my textbooks. And they make sense, but they don't align with anything I've been taught." For a moment, Michelle didn't say anything. She simply stared at him, her gaze unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Maybe history isn't just about facts, Frank. Maybe it's about perspective. And sometimes, the truth is hidden in places you don't even think to look." Frank's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" She smiled softly, but there was an edge to her voice. "You'll understand soon enough. You just have to be willing to look beyond what's written in the books." But Frank wasn't sure he was ready to understand. He didn't know if he wanted to. The more he learned from Michelle, the more unsettled he became. Was history truly as he had been taught? Or was it something entirely different? Something more dangerous? The weeks following Michelle's cryptic comments felt like a blur to Frank. It wasn't just the intensity of their conversations, nor the ever-growing mystery surrounding Michelle's knowledge. It was the subtle sense of disorientation that had begun to creep into his life. As much as he tried to focus on his studies, something about Michelle kept pulling at his mind, the threads of his once sturdy understanding of history unraveling with each passing day. Frank had always been a meticulous student. He prided himself on the clarity with which he approached his work. History, to him, was a linear path of cause and effect, a narrative of choices made, battles fought, and decisions that shaped the course of humanity. But now, that path seemed increasingly muddled. It started small. During a class discussion about World War II, Frank casually mentioned the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand as one of the pivotal events that eventually led to the war. He had just opened his mouth to explain the broader political context when Michelle, who had been quietly listening in the back of the classroom, raised her hand. "That's not how it happened," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not really." Frank blinked in surprise.
"What?"
"The assassination of Ferdinand? I'm pretty sure that was the spark that lit the whole thing." Michelle looked around the room, her eyes briefly meeting his before she turned back to the professor, offering a slight shrug. "The assassination was tragic, yes. But the chain of events that led to the war started far earlier, decades before that assassination. In fact," Frank frowned. He had read everything about the causes of the war, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, the arms race, and the assassination was always presented as the immediate trigger. Yet, here was Michelle, so confident, asserting that the war's roots were far deeper. He opened his mouth to argue, but the professor had already moved on, and Michelle's words lingered in his mind. It wasn't the first time she had corrected him in this way. Her insistence that something fundamental was missing from what Frank had been taught, that there was always more to the story. But it wasn't just her take on history that unsettled him. It was something else. Something far stranger. A few days after the class, Frank and Michelle sat in their usual spot at the coffee shop. Frank had been quietly reading, trying to focus on his assignment about early civilizations when Michelle abruptly shifted the conversation. "Have you heard about the solar storm coming next month?" she asked casually, sipping her coffee as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Frank looked up, his brow furrowing. "Solar storm? What are you talking about?" "The solar storm," she repeated, eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "It's going to be a big one. They say it could disrupt communications and power grids, cause massive outages worldwide. It's been predicted for weeks now." Frank blinked. He hadn't heard anything about it. In fact, he hadn't read any news suggesting such a storm was coming. He scrolled through his phone, checking the latest headlines. Nothing. He glanced back at her, his confusion evident. "Michelle, I think you're mistaken. I haven't seen anything like that in the news. Maybe you're reading some." "No," she interrupted, her voice firm. "It's happening, Frank. You'll see." Frank felt a chill run down his spine, a deep sense of unease creeping up on him. "How do you know about it?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. "How can you be so sure?" She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just one of those things you'll know if you pay attention." Then, in an almost offhand way, she added, "There's also going to be a major earthquake in Chile next year. It'll register over 8.0 on the Richter scale." Frank stared at her, his mouth going dry. He had never heard her mention anything like this before. Not in such detail, not with such certainty. Was she watching the news more closely than he was? But no, he could tell by the way she said it. Michelle wasn't just recalling some vague prediction or rumor. She spoke like she had lived through these events, or at least, like she already knew them. He tried to brush it off, but a knot had formed in his stomach. Over the following days, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He read up on solar storms and earthquake predictions, just to reassure himself. Sure enough, no reports of a solar storm were predicted in the immediate future, and there were no warnings of a major earthquake in Chile either. It was almost as if Michelle had glimpsed the future. Or was it something more? The tension continued to build as more strange incidents occurred. One night, when Frank was studying the Industrial Revolution, he mentioned a particular theory about the role of steam power in shaping modern industry. He was halfway through explaining it when Michelle interrupted again, this time with startling clarity. "That's not quite right," she said, her voice almost apologetic. "Steam power didn't revolutionize industry the way people think. It was more about the infrastructure of transportation, railroads, shipping routes, and the way goods were moved across nations. It was the transportation network, not the steam engines themselves, that allowed for the industrial shift." Frank had no words. The more he listened to Michelle, the more it became clear that she wasn't just knowledgeable about history, she had a far deeper, almost preternatural understanding of it. And it wasn't limited to the past. She knew things about the future. Things that hadn't happened yet. Things that didn't belong in this time. He couldn't deny it any longer. One evening, after one of their long conversations, Frank made a decision. He needed to confront her, once and for all. He couldn't keep pretending that his growing suspicion was just paranoia. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was going on. They sat at their usual table, the dim light from the overhead bulbs casting long shadows across the coffee shop. Frank leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Michelle," he said, his voice tight, "I need to ask you something. You've been telling me things that don't make sense. You're talking about things that haven't happened yet. You know things about history that no one else seems to know," and he took a deep breath, steadying himself, "and I don't think I can ignore it anymore. Are you from the future?" Michelle didn't react immediately. Her gaze was calm, unflinching, but Frank could see the tension in her jaw, the subtle tightening of her shoulders. For a moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again. Finally, she looked him dead in the eyes. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not from the future." Frank's heart sank. He had been hoping for some kind of explanation, some rational answer. But instead, she dropped her gaze and let out a soft sigh. "I'm from the past, Frank," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "A time long before yours." Frank's mind reeled. What do you mean? The past? How far back? Michelle bit her lip, clearly reluctant to say more. I can't explain everything. It's not safe. Not for me, and not for you. Frank leaned forward, a fire of determination burning in his chest.
Why?
What are you hiding? What's so dangerous about telling me the truth? Michelle hesitated, her fingers tapping restlessly on the table. I'm already breaking the rules, Frank, she said softly, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. If anyone finds out what I really am, what I've done, I'll be stuck in this time. Forever. And so will you? The weight of her words hit him like a punch. The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken truths. Michelle was hiding something monumental, something that had the power to shatter everything Frank thought he knew about time, history, and even reality itself. He opened his mouth to press her further, but Michelle stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I'm sorry, she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. I can't say more.
Not now.
Please, just trust me. Before Frank could say anything else, she was gone, leaving him sitting in the empty chair, heart racing, mind spinning with questions he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. The next morning, Frank woke up with a heavy sense of dread weighing down his chest. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the conversation with Michelle over and over again. The confusion, the secrets she had all but admitted, the sheer impossibility of it all. It was too much to process. Frank knew something had changed. He could feel it in the air, in the way Michelle had withdrawn from him the night before. Something had shifted, and he wasn't sure whether it was the weight of her admission or the cold, unspoken fear that lingered in her eyes. She had left in such a hurry, her expression a mix of desperation and sorrow. She hadn't told him where she was going, only that she needed to leave.
But why?
Why had she gone so suddenly? He couldn't stop thinking about the cryptic words she had whispered before running out the door. I'm already breaking the rules, Frank. If anyone finds out what I really am, what I've done, I'll be stuck in this time. Forever. And so will you? The thought of losing her, of losing this, was unbearable. He had fallen in love with her, even though he had no idea what she truly was, where she came from, or what had brought her here. Everything felt so impossible. Yet it was real. The bond between them was real. Or, at least, it had felt real. Frank grabbed his phone from the nightstand, staring at the blank screen, his finger hovering over Michelle's contact. But he couldn't bring himself to call her. He didn't know what he would say, or if she would even answer. He didn't want to push her away further. He didn't want to lose her. But she was gone now, leaving him in the wake of a storm he had never seen coming. At first, he tried to focus on his studies. He needed some semblance of normality, some distraction to keep his mind from spiraling. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. It was as if Michelle had taken a part of him with her when she left. A part he couldn't get back. Days passed, each one feeling more empty than the last. Frank wandered through campus in a fog, trying to engage with his classes, but it was futile. History, the one thing that had always made sense, was now tainted. What he had learned in his lectures and textbooks seemed so distant, so irrelevant compared to the strange, surreal reality he was now living. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, the call came. Frank had just returned to his dorm room after a long day of classes when his phone rang, jolting him out of his stupor. He glanced at the screen, expecting to see an unfamiliar number, perhaps one of his professors or a classmate. But it wasn't. It was a hospital number. His heart dropped into his stomach as he answered. Hello, Mr. Stanton? The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but there was a subtle edge of concern in it. We're calling from St. Mary's Hospital in Georgia. We've found a woman who appears to be in some distress. She's been unconscious for several hours. We're not sure of her identity, but we found a note with your name on it. Is she someone you know? Frank's breath caught in his throat. The words didn't make sense. Georgia? A hospital? The voice continued, oblivious to the shock on Frank's end. We've done our best to stabilize her, but she's in a delicate condition. She's not responding to any identification queries, but the note we found said your name, Mr. Stanton. We need you to come down here if you can. For a moment, Frank's mind was blank. A dozen thoughts swirled through his head, none of them making sense. Michelle. She had left. She had gone to Georgia. Had something happened to her? Of course, Frank said, his voice suddenly hoarse. I'm on my way. His mind was racing as he packed his things, not fully understanding what had happened, only that something was terribly wrong. He barely remembered the flight to Georgia. His mind was consumed with images of Michelle's tear-streaked face, her cryptic words, her departure. What had happened to her? Why had she gone to Georgia? Was she okay? The plane landed, and Frank rushed to the hospital in a daze, his mind still locked on the mystery. When he arrived, he was escorted by a nurse to a small, sterile room where Michelle lay, unconscious on a white hospital bed. She looked so fragile, so small in the large clinical bed. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were closed tightly. Frank's heart twisted in his chest. It was as if she were a different person than the woman he had known, the woman who had spoken with such confidence, such assurance. As he stepped closer to her, he saw a small piece of paper on the table next to the bed. His name was written on it, and beneath it, there was something else. The time is not right for us, but I cannot escape it. Frank felt a shiver run down his spine as he read those words. This note, this cryptic message, was all he had now. All that was left of Michelle. He grabbed the note and looked back at her, his mind spinning with questions. What did she mean by, the time is not right? Why was she so far from him? A nurse entered the room, breaking his concentration. Mr. Stanton, we're doing everything we can, but she's not responding. We've tested for all known conditions, but we can't find any physical trauma. The only thing we can surmise is that it's psychological. She's been through a lot. We'll need to run more tests to see if there's something we've missed. Frank barely heard her. His gaze remained fixed on Michelle's pale face, her body barely moving beneath the covers. The weight of the situation hit him like a wave. He had no idea what had brought her here, why she was in this state. But one thing was clear: Michelle was in trouble, and he needed to help her. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed against her cool skin. Michelle, he whispered, his voice shaking. Please wake up. Please don't leave me. But she didn't respond. Not then, not in that moment. A dozen questions flooded his mind, each one more confusing than the last. Had she been running from something? Or had she been running to something? And what was this about time? All he knew was that Michelle was trapped in a world that wasn't hers, and now, trapped in a state of helplessness that he couldn't seem to escape. As Frank sat there, holding her hand, the world outside the hospital continued to spin. Time marched on. But for him, it had stopped. In that moment, it was just him and Michelle, and the overwhelming question that loomed large in his mind. Could love survive the laws of time? Or was it always doomed to fall apart, lost in the spaces between seconds, in the cracks between past and future? The sterile, white walls of the hospital room felt suffocating, pressing in on Frank as he sat beside Michelle's bed. The faint hum of machines and the soft beeping of heart monitors seemed too loud, too intrusive in the silence that hung between them. He had been there for hours, holding her hand, willing her to wake up, but she had not stirred. The nurse had told him that there was no physical reason for her unconsciousness. They could find no injuries, no immediate cause. It was all psychological, they said. But Frank knew better. He had seen her face the night she left. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the panic that had driven her away. He knew that whatever was happening to her now, it was more than just a mental breakdown. He couldn't stop thinking about the note she had left behind, the words that seemed to speak directly to his heart. The time is not right for us, but I cannot escape it. He didn't know what that meant, but he was desperate to understand. Minutes turned to hours, and the weight of uncertainty bore down on him like an immovable force. The world outside seemed so distant, so irrelevant, as he stared at Michelle's still form, praying for some sign, some indication that she was still there with him. And then it happened. Frank whispered her name, barely more than a breath. Michelle? Her fingers twitched. It was subtle at first, just a soft movement beneath his touch, but it was enough. His heart skipped a beat, and he leaned in closer. "Michelle," he repeated, louder now, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened, slowly, as though fighting against some invisible force. Frank's breath caught in his throat as her gaze slowly focused on him. Her eyes, the same deep, knowing eyes he had fallen in love with, stared at him with a quiet recognition. "Frank," she whispered, her voice a fragile sound, barely audible, as if speaking took every ounce of her strength. She tried to sit up, but the effort was too much, and she collapsed back against the pillow, breathing heavily. Frank's heart ached at the sight of her. So weak, so vulnerable. He had always known her as strong, as someone who held secrets that no one else could even imagine. But now, here she was, laying before him like a broken shell of the person he had once known. He gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing against the cold skin of her cheek. "I'm here, Michelle," he said, his voice rough. "I'm here. You're going to be okay." She managed a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Instead, there was something unreadable there, something filled with sorrow and resignation. "Frank," she began, her voice thick with emotion, I've been so selfish. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want you to get involved. I didn't want you to know." Frank shook his head. "Michelle, stop. What's happening? You're scaring me. Please, tell me what's going on." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to say what she had to say. "I'm not from this time, Frank," she whispered. "I'm not even from your world." Frank's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice rising in confusion. You're not from this time? What does that even mean? Where are you from, Michelle? What's happening to you?" Michelle's fingers tightened around his hand, but there was a faint tremor in her grip. She was fading again, her strength slipping away with every breath. But she pushed through, her voice growing more urgent as she spoke. "I've been stuck here for centuries, Frank," she confessed, her voice cracking. "I was never supposed to be in this time. I was supposed to be somewhere else. Another time, another life. But I broke the rules of time travel, and now I'm paying the price." Frank's mind was spinning, his thoughts a jumbled mess. Time travel? What are you talking about? Time travel isn't real. That's impossible. Michelle's eyes flickered with a sadness that made his heart ache. I know it sounds insane.
I'm sorry.
But I've lived through time, through centuries. I've seen it all. Every shift in history, every change. I know things I shouldn't know. And I couldn't resist. I wanted to be with you, Frank. You were the first person I've met who made me feel like I belonged here. Like I wasn't just a visitor in time. Always passing through, never staying. She paused for a moment, her breath shallow, and Frank could see the weight of her words sinking into her bones. But there are laws of time, Frank. Laws I broke. If I revealed myself, if I told anyone the truth about where I came from, if I told you, then I would never be able to return to my proper time. And my body, my existence would unravel. I'd age. Rapidly. Frank's chest tightened as he listened to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. So that's what's happening? You're aging? Michelle nodded weakly, her lips trembling.
Yes.
I was never meant to live in this time. And the moment I broke the rules, I became like a paradox, a moment out of place. The longer I stay here, the more my body, it can't handle the distortion. She looked at him then, her eyes filled with sorrow and regret. I wanted to be with you so badly, Frank. But I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just trying to find a way back. I thought maybe we could figure it out together. But I was wrong. Frank's heart shattered as he watched her, seeing her frailty, the aging process beginning to take its toll on her. Her skin, once smooth and youthful, was now wrinkled, as though the passage of time had suddenly caught up with her all at once. Her hair, too, had begun to gray at the roots, and her breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. "Michelle, no," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. He gently stroked her hair, his fingers trembling as he tried to hold on to her, to keep her with him.
Please.
You don't have to do this. There has to be something we can do. There has to be a way to fix this. Please. But Michelle's smile was faint, almost imperceptible, as she looked up at him with those tired, ancient eyes. It's too late for me, Frank. The time's already caught up with me. My body, it can't take it anymore. A terrible silence filled the room, and Frank's world seemed to stop. He watched, helpless, as Michelle's body continued to change, the signs of her age accelerating with every passing second. Her face, once youthful and radiant, now appeared like that of an elderly woman, frail, fragile, and worn by centuries of time that had never been meant for her. The lines deepened on her forehead, and her skin became paper-thin. She reached up, weakly brushing his cheek with her fingers, as if trying to commit the feeling of his skin to memory. "I'm sorry, Frank," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted you to be a part of this. I never wanted you to see me like this." Tears welled up in Frank's eyes as he held her close, unable to stop the overwhelming grief that threatened to consume him. "Please don't leave me, Michelle. I love you. I need you. I'll find a way to fix this. I'll fix everything." But Michelle's smile remained, bittersweet and fading, as the inevitable took hold of her. With a final, shuddering breath, she exhaled, her body becoming impossibly frail, her chest stilling. And then, in his arms, Michelle was gone. The room seemed to close in on Frank, and the world outside stopped spinning. Time, that cruel, unrelenting force, had taken her from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he held her lifeless form, a deep, aching emptiness settled over him. The love he had for her, the love that had defied the laws of time itself, had been nothing more than a fleeting, impossible moment. And now, that moment had passed. The room was silent now, save for the faint hum of the machines and the quiet rustle of the hospital's sterile environment. The world outside felt distant, alien. Frank sat, still holding Michelle's frail body, unable to process what had just happened. His heart ached with the weight of his loss, yet something urgent, insistent, pulled at him. It was the gift she had given him. When Michelle had taken her final breath, her body still and lifeless in his arms, Frank didn't know how long he had sat there, numb and paralyzed by grief. But through the haze of sorrow, something else had happened, something he could barely comprehend. In her last moments, as her body began to fade into the grasp of time, Michelle had passed him a small, unassuming device. It was no bigger than the palm of his hand, circular, metallic, and sleek, with an intricate design of patterns etched into its surface. At first, Frank had thought it was merely a trinket, a final keepsake. But then he saw the manual, a folded piece of paper she had slipped into his hand, her fingers cold and trembling. She had given it to him with a quiet urgency, her eyes still holding that same sorrowful depth they had shown in her final moments. The manual was written in a language he didn't recognize at first glance. The characters were alien to him, an elaborate script he had never seen before. But there was something deeply familiar about it, as if it was speaking to a part of him that he hadn't yet understood. Frank stared at the device for a long time, trying to absorb what had just happened.
Michelle, gone.
His love, lost. And yet, she had left him with a parting gift, something that could change everything. The gadget, the device. What was it? What was she trying to tell him? Through the haze of grief, something burned inside Frank. A flicker of hope. A desperate, irrational belief that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to bring her back. If there was a chance, any chance, that Michelle's fate could be reversed, that she could return to her rightful time and live without the curse of time travel, Frank was going to find it. He had to. The days that followed were a blur. Frank couldn't bring himself to leave the hospital. He sat in the small room, holding the gadget in his hands, turning it over, studying its every detail. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Time travel, paradoxes, centuries lost. But the more he tried to focus on the facts, the more his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. The manual. He returned to it time and time again. It had no words Frank could immediately understand. But there were diagrams. And symbols. And something about them tugged at the edges of his mind. Something about the way the device had been constructed felt like it was meant for someone like him, someone with the capacity to understand, to unravel it. At first, he tried to keep up his normal routine, his classes at the University of Pennsylvania, his social life, his studies. But it all felt trivial, meaningless in the face of what had just happened. Nothing mattered anymore. All he cared about was Michelle. All he could think about was the device and the impossible possibility that it held. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world was asleep and Frank could hear only his thoughts, he began his research. He dove into the realms of time travel theory, scouring libraries, university journals, online forums, and obscure websites. The more he read, the more he realized that the concept of time travel was far more complicated and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He spent days lost in the abstract concepts of temporal mechanics and quantum physics. He learned about closed time-like curves, wormholes, and the grandfather paradox. He studied Einstein's theory of relativity, the notion of space-time and gravity, and the speculative theories about wormholes and multiverses that filled the pages of obscure journals. But none of it gave him the answers he was looking for. There were no answers that could explain the device Michelle had left him. No formula, no equation, no theoretical model that could account for its existence. For a moment, Frank felt the weight of despair settle over him. Was it hopeless? Was it impossible? Could time travel truly exist? Was Michelle's fate something that was simply beyond his reach? But then he remembered Michelle's final words to him. She had broken the rules of time. She had been stuck in this moment, in the wrong time for centuries. She had lived in the shadows, only to fall in love with him. And when she had passed him the device, it hadn't been some final token of goodbye. It was a clue, a key to understanding what had happened to her and how he might undo the irreversible. Frank wouldn't, accept the idea that she was gone forever. Not when there was even a faint possibility of fixing it. He had to keep searching. He had to believe. In his obsession, Frank began to focus less on the practicalities of his academic life and more on deciphering the manual. It wasn't just the symbols that intrigued him. It was the subtle hints in the diagrams, the connections between them, the slight traces of science that almost seemed too advanced. He began to notice something peculiar. The diagrams were almost familiar. They reminded him of coding languages. Suddenly, it clicked. The device wasn't just a piece of technology. It was an algorithm, a coded program built to manipulate time itself. The more he studied the symbols, the more he realized that the manual wasn't just a set of instructions, it was a set of rules, a protocol for initiating time travel. Frank's heart raced. This wasn't some obscure, theoretical gadget. It was functional.
It was designed to be used.
And Michelle had entrusted him with it. He felt the pulse of something inside him, a spark of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He began working relentlessly. Night after night, he pored over the manual, tracing the symbols, cross-referencing the diagrams, plugging them into software models he created himself. His mind, once consumed by the study of history, now felt like a machine. Everything he had learned about patterns, about data, about systems, now felt like it had prepared him for this moment. The device was a puzzle, a mystery, and Frank wasn't going to rest until he had solved it. Days turned into weeks. His classmates wondered where he had gone. His professors noticed his absence. But Frank was beyond caring. He had a singular goal now, one obsession that burned brighter than any academic achievement. He had to figure out how to send Michelle back to the right time. He had to unlock the secrets of the gadget. And with every hour spent studying, researching, and working, Frank could feel it. He was getting closer. Slowly, but surely, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. He didn't know what the future would hold. He didn't know if he could even fix what had happened to Michelle. But one thing was certain. He was no longer the same person who had met her. He was no longer a student of history. He was now a student of time itself. And time was something he was determined to master. The days blurred together as Frank poured himself deeper into his research. What had begun as an academic curiosity, an intellectual pursuit, was now an obsession. He couldn't think about anything else. The world of history, his professors, his peers, they all seemed so distant, so irrelevant. All that mattered now was Michelle, the strange device she had left behind, and the fragments of knowledge she had entrusted to him. He scoured every corner of the internet, devoured books on physics, quantum mechanics, and time theory. He immersed himself in papers on time manipulation, reading theories on wormholes, temporal anomalies, and closed time-like curves. But nothing was concrete. Nothing led him closer to the answer. That was until he started looking at data. At first, he'd been lost in the physical mechanics of it all. The idea of bending time, distorting it, folding it into something he could understand. But then, one night, while reviewing the manual again, something clicked. The gadget Michelle had given him was more than just a device. It was a program, a data system, a set of rules coded into the very fabric of the object. And Frank, with his background in history and his burgeoning interest in software engineering, had the perfect toolkit to begin deciphering it. He used his knowledge of historical events, timelines, and the interwoven patterns of human behavior to draw parallels with the gadget's mysterious schematics. Time, he realized, wasn't a singular line but rather a complex network of data points, all connected in a web of cause and effect. And just like any other system, there were rules, boundaries, conditions, loops that governed it. As the weeks passed, Frank grew more and more absorbed. His understanding of time began to evolve, merging his historical insights with technical skills. He drew graphs, plotted timelines, and built simulations. Slowly, he discovered that the device wasn't just a portal to the past, it was a limiter. The machine could send him back, but only in short, controlled bursts. It wasn't capable of traveling through centuries at once. He would have to move in small increments, no more than a few hundred years at a time. The first step, he realized, was learning how to control the device's parameters. He had to understand its data structures, its limitations. The more he experimented, the clearer it became. Time wasn't a single, linear path, but a collection of intersecting moments. And he could traverse those moments, but only if he followed the exact rules Michelle had hinted at.
It was frustrating. Slow.
He wasn't sure if the device would even work or if he would ever get the settings right. But one thing was undeniable. He had a direction now. A first step. Frank sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. The lines of code, the diagrams, the historical records, it was all beginning to fit together, piece by piece. And for the first time in months, he felt the faintest spark of hope. He wasn't just studying time anymore. He was beginning to master it. The air was thick with humidity as Frank stepped out of the dimly lit room. The device hummed softly in his hand, its metal surface cold against his skin. Years of study, of trial and error, had led to this moment. Every diagram, every symbol, every calculation had been an attempt to make this work, an attempt to go back, to find her again. And now, after all the frustration, the sleepless nights, the endless research, Frank was standing at the threshold of history itself. He adjusted the settings one last time, his breath shallow with anticipation. His fingers hovered over the controls, knowing this could be his only shot. A few hundred years, that was all he had. The device could not carry him further back in time than that, at least not without consequences. The risks were unimaginable, but Frank had no choice. He had come too far to turn back now. With a final, steadying breath, Frank pressed the activation button. The world around him flickered, distorted, shifting like a broken television screen. The colors of the room bled together, swirling into a vortex of light. He felt the familiar pull, the unsettling sensation of being ripped from one moment and thrust into another, as if his very molecules were being torn apart and put back together again. Time itself stretched and compressed in ways his mind could barely comprehend. And then, silence. When Frank opened his eyes, the world was different. He stood in the middle of a dirt road, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. The scent of fresh earth and wildflowers filled his lungs, and a faint, earthy breeze rustled the leaves in the trees surrounding him. He turned slowly, taking in the landscape. Fields stretched out in every direction, dotted with the occasional wooden farmhouse. A few people passed by, dressed in period clothing, long dresses, wide-brimmed hats, work boots, and suspenders. This was the 19th century, but not exactly the right time. Not the period he had intended. The device had worked, but the limits of its functionality had become apparent. He was somewhere between the mid-1800s and the turn of the century, close enough, but still not the exact moment he had hoped for. Frank didn't have time to dwell on the imperfections. He had a goal, a single mission. He needed to find Michelle. And he needed to find her now. He started walking, his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts consumed by the girl he had loved and lost. He had no idea where she was or how far he'd come, but there was a deep sense of déjà vu in the air. As he passed a large oak tree near the road, a sound broke through his reverie, a soft voice, humming a familiar tune. Frank's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. There, sitting on a stone bench by the side of the road, was Michelle. But not the woman he had left behind in the hospital. This Michelle was younger, radiant, her beauty untarnished by the weight of time. Her hair cascaded in loose curls down her back, and her eyes, the same deep, knowing eyes, sparkled with a carefree innocence he hadn't seen before. She was laughing with a group of children, her voice light, her demeanor joyful. She looked completely unaware of the man standing just a few feet away, her life unfolding before her as if nothing had changed. As if she hadn't already lived 1,000 years. For a moment, Frank could hardly move. He felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was it. This was his chance to be with her again, to rewrite history, to fix what had gone wrong. But as he stepped closer, uncertainty crept in. She didn't recognize him. She couldn't. The woman he had known, the woman he had loved, was gone, buried under the weight of centuries. He watched her for a long moment, hesitating. He had thought this would be easier, to come back to her, to pick up where they had left off. But now, standing before her, all he could think about was how much had changed. How much she had changed. Finally, taking a deep breath, Frank approached her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, his heart pounding. "I couldn't help but notice you sitting here. Are you from around here?" Michelle turned, startled at the voice interrupting her moment with the children. She looked at him with a slight frown, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to place him. But there was no recognition. "No, I'm not from around here," she said with a smile, her voice warm and polite. "I'm just visiting for the day. I like to come out here to relax, when I can." Her smile widened, and she glanced at the children. "They keep me company when I need a break from the housework." Frank's stomach twisted in a mixture of disbelief and longing. This wasn't the woman he had known, the woman who had confided in him, who had shared her deepest secrets. This was someone else. Someone new. "I'm Frank," he said, extending a hand. "Frank Addison." She looked at him for a moment longer before shaking his hand. "Michelle," she replied. "It's nice to meet you, Frank." As they exchanged pleasantries, Frank couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of loss. She was here. She was alive. She was beautiful, radiant, and free. But she was also a stranger to him, someone who had yet to discover the weight of time, the burden of the future. For a brief moment, Frank thought back to Michelle's last words to him, the warning that staying in the wrong time for too long would have consequences. Time was an unforgiving thing. The longer he stayed, the more she would age, and the more he risked altering her future, their future. As much as he longed to stay here, to be with her again, he knew he couldn't. They couldn't. With every minute they spent together, the laws of time would push her closer to the unraveling fate she had faced before. The cycle of aging, of decay, would begin again.
His heart sank.
He couldn't bear to see her wither away. Not again. "Michelle, I have to go," Frank said suddenly, his voice raw with emotion. Her brows furrowed in confusion. "Go? But we just met." "I know," Frank said, stepping back. "But I can't stay. I'm not supposed to be here." She looked at him, her expression softening, but she didn't press him. Instead, she gave him a quiet nod. "Maybe I'll see you again, Frank." As he turned to walk away, his heart was torn between the girl he had found and the girl he had lost. He had come so close, so incredibly close. But time, that cruel, unyielding force, was pulling them apart again. And for the first time, Frank truly understood what Michelle had meant when she said there were laws of time. Time had no mercy, and neither did he. The days following Frank's return to the 19th century had been a whirlwind. His heart, torn between the joy of finding Michelle and the anxiety of knowing the dangers that lurked in the folds of time, struggled to catch up with the events unfolding around him. At first, it felt like a dream, walking alongside her, getting to know the woman she was before centuries had passed. They spent afternoons walking through the fields, talking about everything and nothing, while Frank tried to resist the crushing urge to reveal the truth about what had happened to them both. But the longer they were together, the more he felt the weight of his secret pressing down on him. The laws of time, the rules that governed her very existence, were catching up with him, and with them. Then, in the midst of the idyllic days in Georgia, the world around them began to change. The winds shifted, and there was a tension in the air. At first, Frank didn't know what it was. The people around them, once so calm and collected, were suddenly restless, murmuring in groups and exchanging worried glances. Whispers of conflict, of unrest, of war began to grow louder. And then one morning the news came. The American Civil War had erupted. Frank had heard about it in his history books, of course. The North versus the South. Brother fighting against brother. But hearing the whispers of it, feeling the air thick with the weight of a nation on the brink of war, was something entirely different. It wasn't a chapter in a textbook anymore. It was real. It was here. "Frank, what's happening?" Michelle asked, her voice laced with worry. "I overheard talk this morning. They say the war is coming." Frank's heart sank. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, but the rumblings were unmistakable. The tension between the North and South had reached a boiling point, and now the country was on the edge of an all-out conflict. What had once been a far-off historical event was now unfolding before his eyes. "I don't know," Frank said, trying to hide his own fear. He knew this war would reshape everything, both for the nation and for their future. The time travel laws he'd come to understand in theory were now at the mercy of history's violent tides. The chaos of war, its unpredictable nature, its upheaval of normality, would distort the fabric of time itself. They couldn't stay. The more Frank thought about it, the clearer the dangers became. The device was already fragile, operating within limits. The more turbulent the period they were in, the more likely the fabric of time itself would rip. The more they lingered in the chaos, the more unstable the machine would become, and the more Michelle would age. The laws of time travel were merciless. Once again, Michelle would begin to deteriorate, her age catching up with her, the strain of existing outside her rightful time frame wearing her down. The war would only make things worse. As rumors of battles and skirmishes reached them, Frank realized they had no choice. They needed to get out. Get away from the war before it could disrupt the delicate balance of time. The further they moved from the epicenter of the conflict, the safer they would be. The more calm, more peaceful the area, the easier it would be to keep the device functional. "We need to go," Frank said, grabbing Michelle's hand, his eyes wild with urgency. "We can't stay here. Not with this war coming. Time will break down if we do." Michelle's eyes widened in alarm, her hand tightening around his. "Where do we go? What can we do?" "We need to head north, further north, away from the fighting. We have to get to Canada. It's the only place that might be far enough away from the war to avoid the chaos. There's silence there. Quiet. And we need it. To think. To plan." For a moment, Michelle hesitated, a flash of fear crossing her face. "Canada?" she asked, confused. "But that's so far. It's dangerous to travel in these times." "I know," Frank said, his voice sharp with fear. "But it's our only chance. The longer we stay here, the more we risk everything. You can't age again."
Not like that.
"Not after everything we've been through. If we're going to make it back to the future, to your rightful time, we need to get out of here. We need a place to think. To work. to figure out how to move forward. Michelle swallowed hard, nodding slowly. She could see the truth in Frank's eyes. The urgency, the determination. She knew he was right. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was real, and it was closing in on them. The journey to Canada would be long and perilous. They would have to move carefully, avoiding the major roads and keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Every step away from Georgia felt like one step further into the unknown. But Frank couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. They left at dawn, packing only what they could carry. Frank had some money, enough to get them by for a few weeks, and a plan to stay off the beaten path. They would travel under the cover of night, avoiding large towns and cities, staying away from any military presence. Every day, they moved further from the war and closer to a future that felt more uncertain than ever. As they passed through small, rural towns, the tension was palpable. The streets were filled with soldiers, families, and workers, all bracing themselves for the impact of the war that was already beginning to affect everyone. News of battles, of fallen soldiers, of shifting alliances spread like wildfire. People spoke in hushed tones, fearful of the future. They had to keep moving. But despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of their situation, there was a strange sense of peace in Michelle's eyes. Perhaps it was the quiet of the countryside, or perhaps it was the time they had spent together, rediscovering each other. Whatever it was, Frank could see the flicker of hope in her gaze. She trusted him. And for the first time in a long while, so did he. Still, the fear never left his chest. Every time they stopped to rest, every time they crossed a border or passed a checkpoint, Frank was acutely aware of the danger they were in. The future was constantly at risk. Time was always just one misstep away from unraveling. Finally, after days of travel, they reached the border of Canada. Frank didn't know if they were truly safe, but they had made it further than he had hoped. The quiet, serene expanse of the Canadian wilderness stretched out before them, untouched by the turmoil of the war they had just escaped. Here, in the northern silence, they would find what they needed: time. A chance to rest. To think. To plan their next leap. But even here, in this quiet, Frank couldn't shake the sense that time was never truly on their side. The longer they stayed, the more unstable things would become. They were still caught in the tide of history, an unpredictable, dangerous force they could never fully control. And the war? It was just one chapter in a much larger story. The journey north was long and arduous, but the landscape that unfolded before them in the final leg of their escape brought a sense of peace that had eluded them for months. As they crossed into Canada, the air grew crisper, the world quieter. The war, the brutality of it, the noise, the fear, felt like a distant memory, a shadow in the rear view of their lives. Here, at the northern edge of the world, they were free from the chaos that had surrounded them for so long. In this isolated part of the world, where the whisper of the wind was the loudest sound, Frank and Michelle found solace. The vast, untouched wilderness stretched for miles, broken only by small, peaceful settlements and endless forests. It was here that they would stop. It was here that they would make their final leap. For the first time in months, Frank allowed himself to breathe. The device, which had carried them through time, now felt like a lifeline. But it was also a reminder of all they had been through, of all the pain they had endured, and of everything that still lay ahead. "Are you sure this is it?" Michelle asked one evening, her voice quiet as she stared out over the snowy horizon. They had found a small cabin in the woods, far from any roads or towns, where the stars filled the sky in ways that felt almost too perfect to be real. "Are we safe here? Are you sure we can make it work?" Frank, seated at a small table, tinkered with the device. His fingers were sure, steady, an artist working with technology, a student of time now capable of bending it. He had spent years studying its inner workings, applying every ounce of his new skills in software engineering and data science. He had analyzed it from every angle, using everything he knew about algorithms, data structures, and temporal mechanics. He had pushed the boundaries of what he thought was possible. And now, standing at the precipice of the unknown, He felt more confident than ever before. "I'm sure," Frank said, looking up at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "We've come this far. This is the final step." Michelle nodded, though her gaze was still filled with doubt. "You know this is more than just a jump, don't you? It's not just about us. It's about everything. The world, history, the future, what we've been through." Frank reached out, taking her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "I know," he said softly, "but we've done the impossible. We've fought time, history, and destiny. We've already changed everything. This is the chance to make it right." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for something in him, something that would finally ease the uncertainty that had plagued her heart. And in that moment, Frank realized what he had been trying to ignore all along. He hadn't just changed history or the future. He had changed them, and she had changed him too. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, a promise lingering in the air between them. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Michelle nodded. "Let's do it." The device hummed as Frank adjusted the final settings. A rush of energy coursed through it, and a strange, surreal light filled the room. Time itself seemed to bend around them, folding inward, compressing into a singular point. Frank felt the familiar pull of the vortex, the disorienting force of being torn from one moment to another. But this time, there was no fear, only certainty. The world around them distorted, colors bleeding together. And then, with a sharp tug, everything went still. When Frank opened his eyes, the air was different. The space around them felt cleaner, sharper. The world didn't feel as chaotic as it had before. Instead, it was composed, structured, precise, and organized in a way that he could barely comprehend. Michelle gasped softly beside him, her voice thick with emotion. "Frank, I remember." Frank turned to her, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "All of it. Everything. The past, the future, our time together. All of it's clear now. I can see it all." She smiled. No, it was more than that. It was a radiant expression of joy and relief, the weight of centuries lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in 1,000 years, she was free from the pull of time. She wasn't stuck in any moment, no longer held captive by the clock. She was herself, whole, with her memories restored, her history intact. Frank's heart swelled with relief, and, for a moment, it felt like all the battles they had fought, against time, against history, against the laws of fate, had been worth it. They had made it to the future. Around them, the world was different, too. The buildings were sleek and futuristic, though not in the way Frank had imagined. There were no flying cars or giant skyscrapers, but there was a quiet innovation in the air. Technology, in this time, had evolved differently, more organically, subtly. And the people, they seemed more aware, more in tune with their surroundings, their lives, their histories. There was a calm here, a sense of peace that Frank hadn't expected. Michelle reached out to touch his arm, her eyes wide as she looked around. "Frank, look, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for." He smiled, nodding. "We've made it." As the years passed, Frank adapted to the world of the future. His knowledge of data science, augmented by his historical expertise, had put him at the forefront of the technological revolution. He became a brilliant engineer and scientist, known for his ability to merge history with technology in ways that no one else had considered. His background in history, combined with his mastery of data and software engineering, allowed him to build the frameworks that would shape the future. But more than that, it allowed him to create something that would change the world in ways no one had ever anticipated. Using the collective memories of Michelle's long life, her knowledge of historical events, and her first-hand experiences across centuries, Frank developed one of the most advanced artificial intelligence systems the world had ever seen. An AI not just capable of learning, but of understanding time itself, understanding the intricacies of history, the patterns of human behavior, and the complexity of existence. With Michelle's memories as the foundation, Frank's creation became something more than just a machine. It became a bridge, a way to understand humanity's past, to guide its future. The AI, known as Kronos, grew beyond its original programming. It became the key to understanding time itself, a system capable of advising world leaders, predicting trends, and even helping to maintain the delicate balance between progress and preservation. But more than anything, it was a testament to the love between Frank and Michelle, a love that had defied the very laws of time. They had rebuilt the future together. And in the end, as Frank sat in front of his terminal, watching the artificial intelligence he had built from history unfold, he realized that it wasn't just time that had changed. It was everything. The world, his understanding of it, and his place within it. Michelle's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and full of warmth. "Frank, look how far we've come. Together." He turned to her, his heart full. She hadn't just helped him reshape the future. She had made him believe in the possibility of it. And now, standing side by side in this new world, free from the constraints of time, they had all the time in the world. The future Frank had built was a strange one. It was not the future he had once imagined, the future of flying cars, towering cities, and sleek technology that would make life easier. It was quieter, subtler. The world hummed with the promise of possibility, but it did so without the overbearing noise of progress. It was a future shaped not just by the hands of scientists and engineers, but by the wisdom of history, the lessons learned from the past, and the memories of a woman who had once lived across centuries, lost and found again. Frank had created a life here, a world that balanced technology and humanity, progress and preservation. His AI, Kronos, guided this world with an understanding of time that no human being could ever possess. It wasn't just about understanding how to manipulate time. It was about understanding how to coexist with it, how to learn from it, and how to shape a future that would honor both the past and what was yet to come. Frank's life was an existence without a time limit, yet every moment was imbued with the memory of the past, his past with Michelle. It was strange, in some ways, to live without the burden of time looming over him. In their final leap, they had escaped the destructive effects of time on Michelle's body, but it was never the same. Though they had succeeded, though they had made it, Frank could not deny the truth that lingered in his mind. Time had altered their love, shaped it in ways that even Kronos could not predict. Every morning, he would wake up and see her there beside him. She looked the same, timeless, forever 21, with that same quiet grace she had always possessed.
But there was a subtle difference now.
Though Michelle had her memories back, her vast, centuries-spanning memories, there was a distance between them now. The rules of time had not just affected her appearance, they had affected how they existed together in the present. The time they had spent apart, the centuries that separated them, could not be erased, no matter how much Frank wished it could. They could never go back to the way things were, he knew that. There was no erasing the fracture in their history, the impossibility of fully reconciling the timelines they had disrupted. Michelle had lived 1,000 lives, in 1,000 different places, and though they had found a way to be together, they could never truly undo what time had done. The memories, the experiences, the gaps between their shared moments, they remained like a shadow behind them, a reminder of the price they had paid to defy the very laws of existence. But that didn't stop them from trying. They lived together, working side by side, watching as Kronos helped shape the future. Frank poured his energy into making the world better, using the knowledge he had gained over the years to help build a society that no longer feared technology, but embraced it. They had learned from the past, learned from their mistakes, and now they were forging ahead into a future that was grounded in wisdom, in understanding. Together, they had helped craft a reality where humanity could thrive, sustainably, peacefully, without the same mistakes made again. Michelle was more than just his partner in this work, she was the foundation. Every word of Kronos was infused with the vast knowledge she had accumulated over a lifetime, centuries of experiences and historical insights, memories of worlds long gone, and worlds yet to come. She was a living testament to the resilience of humanity and love across time. But her own desires were simpler now. She didn't yearn for the past anymore. She had accepted that time had broken them in ways that could never be fixed. Instead, she dedicated herself to the present, helping Frank to continue their work, seeing the world through a lens that no one else could quite understand. Yet, there was still the haunting knowledge that their love could never fully exist in the way they had once dreamed. Time had given them everything and nothing. It had stolen so much, but it had also given them a gift that no other couple could ever claim: the ability to reshape the world, to rewrite history, to create a future with the wisdom of the past. One day, as they sat together in the quiet of their home, Frank turned to Michelle, his hand resting lightly on hers. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. "The way it used to be? When we didn't have to worry about times?" Michelle smiled, though her eyes seemed distant for a moment, lost in a place he couldn't reach. "Sometimes," she said, "I think about it. About all the moments we could have shared, all the things we didn't have time to experience. But then I remember, time isn't really what matters. What matters is now. This moment. What we're doing with it." Frank looked at her, the truth of her words sinking in. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps time wasn't the enemy they had always thought it was. Perhaps it wasn't about going back or trying to fix things, but about living in the present, making the most of the time they had together. "We've done something incredible, haven't we?" Frank said, a sense of awe in his voice. "Together, we've changed everything. Not just the future, but the way the world will think about time. We've made it our own." Michelle nodded, her fingers squeezing his. "And we've done it with love. With each other. And that's more than any of us could have ever hoped for." As they sat together, Frank could feel the weight of the years they had spent apart, the years they had spent fighting for their love, for their future. But it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a legacy that stretched far beyond the boundaries of time, far beyond the lifetimes they had lived. The world they had helped create was just beginning to take shape. And though Frank knew that their time together would always be limited by the same forces they had fought against for so long, he also knew that their impact would last forever. Together, they had transcended time. Together, they had created something greater than themselves. Their love, their work, their memories, and their sacrifices would echo through the ages, shaping the future in ways no one could predict. And in the end, Frank understood that perhaps that was enough. To live beyond time. To live for each other, and for the world they had created. In the centuries that followed, Chronos became the foundation of a new world. Its algorithms, shaped by Frank's data-driven genius and Michelle's centuries of lived experience, guided humanity through times of uncertainty, helping leaders navigate the complexities of history. It was no longer just a tool for predicting the future, but a bridge between generations, an AI that held the collective wisdom of both the past and the present. Frank, now an elder in this new world, had long ago passed on his legacy to the next generation of innovators. But his name, and Michelle's, remained, not just in the data, but in the hearts of those who understood the importance of time, of love, and of the choices they made. Their story was a quiet one, not broadcast to the world, but whispered between generations, a reminder that time is both a gift and a burden, and that love, true love, transcends both. And as Frank looked out over the world he had helped to shape, he knew that while they could never be together in the way they once were, their love, though it had defied time, would continue to shape the future, long after they were gone. It was a love that lived beyond time. Thank you for listening to this audiobook. Don't forget to subscribe for more.